Please welcome your MC, Rupert Brahini.
One of these days, they're going to get my name right, and I'll be here when that happens. Welcome back. This huge crowd, exciting to see you. You're in the home stretch. This is the afternoon session. It's all thriller, no filler, and we're running right until 4:25. You will get your best in-show party for VR and AR. I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to have a quick question. I'm supposed to keep it succinct, but I think I'm going crazy. Did anybody see a meteorite in the sky last night around 10:30? Or did I drink too much at the after party? There was just, the clouds lit up bright green for a few seconds. And it was either somebody drowning at sea with a flare, but if you hear somebody, tell me, because I want to know, because I'd never seen anything like it before. It was magical. Talking of magical, we've got some great apps for you, O.Live, check it out. You can connect, you can network, all to your heart's connect. That will exist after the show, so do check it out. It's a wonderful tool. But now, very happy to announce we're doing an exceedingly timely program announcing reframing identity for mixed reality. We've had VR, AR, what happens when you bring them all together? Identity across digital and physical, coming together in entirely new ways. And to walk us through this process, I'd like you to welcome Microsoft's Senior Director for Rule of Law, Cornelia Kutterer, who is leading the panel. Thank you.
Very gentle.
Yes, thanks for the reminder.
Very gentle. There are a couple of more people than this morning. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody, here in the room and also online. We see that we have also people that watch the streaming. We're very grateful for that. Today's panel is about reframing identity for mixed reality. We have a wonderful panel here, all experts on the topic of augmented and mixed reality metaverse. And so I will dig in and start the conversation. Karim, Joan, Carrie, please, when I ask the question, can you also introduce yourself to the audience? So what are we actually talking about? Mixed reality, augmented reality, metaverse. I heard there were a lot of definitions attempted already over the last 1.5 days. So give us your visions here, please.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. Karim Mohammadali. I'm with Google, leading the AR/VR public policy program. So, should we introduce ourselves first, all of us?
Sure. Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
I'm Joan OHara. I am Vice President of Public Policy for the XR Association, which is a trade association focused exclusively on XR technology, and we're based in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Carrie Valladares. I'm a Senior Corporate Counsel at Microsoft, and I support our mixed reality team and Microsoft Mesh.
Awesome. Okay, so our vision for the metaverse. I do want to set the stage a little bit and widen our aperture. So the metaverse, not just string of connected virtual worlds, but the term is, I think, a little bit more abstract than that. And the way I think about it is, as the internet has evolved, we've seen this transformation from real world into the digital world. And so it's not some distant mirage on the horizon, but if you think about the evolution of the internet, we went from text-based computing to video conferences, and we're playing Fortnite, and so I think these are all kind of inclusive under the umbrella term of the metaverse. And so I think AR and VR are kind of like a continuation along the spectrum. And so, actually, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
It's the million-dollar question for the week, for the year. What is the metaverse? I think that the simplest way to think about it is that it's a three-dimensional internet. So the way we're able to communicate with one another, access information, control devices in our lives, and access all of that at this point through smartphones, laptops, desktop computers, that will be expanded, but essentially it's the same sort of idea. So connecting, hopefully seamlessly, and being able to move among various platforms, and if we choose to, with an avatar with a sense of embodiment, but an extension of what we have now. So building on the two-dimensional internet and bringing it into 3 dimensions with persistence and a sense of embodiment.
Yeah, so I would agree with Joan, and in fact, I was kind of thinking persistence. So I do think the metaverse is a continuation of technology we already have, and in many ways, we've seen lots of individual metaverses already existing, primarily in gaming, as Karim mentioned. The thing that, for me, that really kind of takes it to the next level, and I wouldn't say necessarily adds new legal issues, but perhaps challenges some of the solutions that we've identified as an industry to address certain issues like safety or privacy or what have you, is the element of persistence. So now your identity and your existence in this space isn't necessarily confined to your relationship with a single provider, and the immersion. Mm-hmm. Clearly the immersion really causes your response or your experience in response to a particular event to be felt in a much deeper, more visceral way than what we've seen with 2D internet. And then getting back to kind of the AR, VR, it's interesting to think about the metaverse as really not confined or bound to a particular form factor or way of engaging, but indeed you could imagine a scenario where you've got a group of people interacting in a meeting or in their personal lives, and some are in VR on a headset, and others are experiencing it in augmented reality as a holographic embodiment. Others, you may have an avatar that's not even in human form, and finally people experiencing on 2D that don't really have that immersive experience but are still receiving the input from those who do. So I think that just creates a lot of interesting permutations on issues that we've all dealt with but perhaps now need to be revisited. Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much. This is a great start into the discussion. Carrie, you mentioned the word engaging, and so this leads us to the human computing interaction. Of course, human computing interaction has not started with the metaverse. In fact, it's here for a while, and and really it's almost like a metaphysical conversation about ourselves. So who am I? The identity. And so before we go into how we relate and reframe in these new environments, let's just talk a little bit about the concept itself. What is the concept of identity? What does it mean for people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the way I think about identity, it's a more complex topic than you might initially think, but at its simplest for me, it's who you are and how you present yourself to the world. And context matters, right? So for this audience, I might present myself as a silly American, but if I'm talking to another American, I might say I'm from Chicago or I live in New York. And similarly, in the digital world, that context matters. And so I don't think of identity as kind of like an A or B choice, but more of a continuation along a spectrum, depending on that context.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned that it's more of a metaphysical question, because on panels I've done, I'm usually the one who says that it's more than a tech conversation. This is really a question about what it means to be a human being, and you could go off on a philosophical tangent. But I do think it matters, and identity, that's a topic we could explore for hours on end. But I think something important to keep in mind is the idea of mutable characteristics versus immutable characteristics. Where's the line, and is that going to be blurred in the metaverse? So mutable characteristics, things that you can change, your appearance, your hair color, the way that you dress, sort of your image, your brand. Those are things that you can change about your identity. In real life, things that you can't change, your biometric identifiers, your age, your race and ethnicity. If you're presenting yourself in the physical real world, those are considerations. What can you change? What can you adapt to certain situations, and what can't you? In the metaverse or in XR, I think those questions will be different. And currently, you can almost disguise yourself or present yourself in a different way if you're in a chat room or something along those lines in 2 dimensions. But when you add that idea of presence and really feeling like you're in the room with someone, and it's not words on a screen, but someone who might be standing right next to you, and they're presenting as a young teenager, but they're really a middle-aged man or something. I think that we have to explore questions around that, because that will have a different impact. When you're, it might be in the back of your mind that the person that you're standing next to in virtual reality might not be at all who they appear to be. So it's an important question.
So I would get really metaphysical, actually, with this question. And I think it's super interesting to think about the difference between your own believed identity and the perceived identity that you possess. And, really, it's all of us kind of walk around living both of those at the same time. We know who we are inside, who we feel we are, what's important to us, but we may choose to share, bits and pieces of that with others, depending on the circumstance, depending on our level of trust. And then at the same time, each of us is perceived to be someone else. Every single person you meet will perceive you to be something slightly different from the other. So there's really no single identity that any one person has. Mm-hmm. And I think that the kind of power, both for good and for bad, of mixed reality and, eventually the metaverse, is that we are separating, or we're separating those two identities in a way that hasn't necessarily been done before, and creating an ability to manipulate the perceived identity in a way that doesn't exist in the physical world. Mm-hmm. And again, that can be a very empowering tool. It can allow people to live an existence that may feel much more true and honest to who they feel they are inside, if they feel that the physical world and the perception that they give off frustrates that identity. It can also be used, of course, to disguise or deceive people for nefarious purposes. So I think that is a really fascinating way to look at identity and think about it, and mixed reality certainly exacerbates those distinctions in a way that we maybe haven't seen as much. Even social media, you've got problems with people having a stage name or whatever, but because of the immersive aspect and the persistence in mixed reality, there is a belief, I think, and almost kind of a confidence that what you're experiencing is true, is much like what you would experience in the physical world. That doesn't exist in a 2D interaction.
Mm-hmm. So is there then a need to rethink identity in the mixed reality?
I think so. I think we need to be perhaps a little more metaphysical about it. I think we need to be a little more philosophical about what identity really is, and understand that the purpose of mixed reality is to play with the physical, the limits of physics that exist in our space. And we have to think about how that layers onto whatever those limits may have done as far as identifying, or as far as defining identity. And I don't know that I hear a lot of people talking about that or really thinking about it in that way. And I worry that there will be unintended consequences if we don't kind of take a step back and look at it a little more philosophically.
Yeah. Maybe elaborating a little bit more on that, can you sort of give us some examples where you see this could be a huge opportunity if we think more freely about identity in this mixed reality, or otherwise where we eventually need to protect identity in the metaverse, in the mixed reality? And I just use these terms now as one, even so there's differences. John, do you want to start with it?
Well, if I could take a step back and just comment on what Carrie was saying as well. Mm-hmm. I agree that there are positive opportunities and tales of caution. Trying on new identities is not a new concept for human beings. Adolescents and teenagers and even adults have been doing it for millennia. That's one of the fun things about being a teenager, is you're always trying on sort of different personalities and seeing what feels comfortable to you, and that changes over time. That's not a new concept. I mean, I personally used to I went to a very nice Catholic school on Long Island, and I wore a uniform every day, and that was my persona and personality. But I also grew up outside of Manhattan and loved to go to the nightclubs on the weekends, so dressed a little bit differently for that. And that's fun. That's exploring who you are, and you should do that. I think the downside is if you have, and this is just potentially, if you have a completely different identity in, say, the metaverse, and it's your avatar, and you're able to use that avatar across various platforms, so that becomes your identity in digital reality. And it's very different from your real world physical identity. Does a young person have trouble with reconciling the two? Would it cause confusion? I think there's great potential to explore, to see how you might be perceived, what your interactions are like with a different personality that you're trying on. But I also think that it's something that we should be thinking about, especially in terms of young people, on how that will impact their emotional growth in the long term. But some of this are things that we can think about now, but I think some of it is going to be learning through experience as well.
I'm sorry, real quick, it's your turn, but I just want to say, that's so interesting because I've heard lots of people talk about the risk of deception on kind of the person that you're engaging with, but I haven't actually heard anyone talk about the confusion that could exist in the person who's chosen to represent themselves other than their physical manifestation. So I don't have anything to say about it other than that's very interesting, and we should definitely all think about it. Okay, Karim.
So I think when it comes to adaptable identities and by extension anonymity, it's not a new concept, right? The internet, you can be anonymous or you can be a different version of yourself. And I think that's a really powerful thing, right? We can communicate without fear of exposing ourselves, or we can protect our sensitive information, or we can enjoy entertainment and things that we could do that we may not be able to do in the real world. It also presents some issues that currently exist, right? So online crime, using encrypted messaging for trafficking, fraud and identity theft, phishing, right? So these things I don't think will go away in mixed reality or the metaverse. They'll just transform. And so the way I would think about it maybe is like early Photoshop to deep fakes, right? So we have to be prepared ahead of time, and I think that's exactly why this topic is important.
I love that. I love this conversation is going without me perfect. What I'm sometimes doing, I'm looking at my screen here because I want to give an opportunity to the online audience as well to potentially ask questions through the chat that I can pose to the panelists. And of course, you can also start like in a couple of minutes to prepare yourself for questions if you have so. In the meantime, I'll continue. We were talking about the potential of exploring different identities, also the potential impact this has. But I want to stick a little bit to this different identities and the impact on society. Do you see also positive impacts? You mentioned some threats like fraud and deep fakes.
I think representation's probably an obvious benefit. So online, if you can represent yourself in the form of an avatar that aligns to who you perceive yourself to be, that is one thing that is a little bit harder to do in today's version of the internet. But I'm curious if y'all have.
Yeah, I agree. I do think if the promise of kind of the metaverse is at its core that it brings people together in ways that are not, necessarily easy or practical in the physical world, then that promise can only be fulfilled if people truly feel welcome and able to participate. And I do think that the ability to represent yourself in a way that feels good and comfortable and honest will be key to the success of the technology and of the realization of the vision. There is a huge tension, of course, between inclusion in that way and security. And I don't mean like data security, I mean like just online safety. And it gets even more complicated when you start talking about underage users, which, Joan, you kind of referenced. So I think that tension exists. I don't think anyone has even come close to answering it, nor do we even know what all the questions are. I may have jumped ahead to one of your questions. Sorry about that,
That's
Cornelia.
okay. And by now you might have realized you're sitting in a policy conversation, if that wasn't clear from the title of the session.
Yeah. But I do think I think there is an enormous potential to allow people to kind of be true to themselves and to engage in a way that feels good and is comfortable and unlocks empowerment for people, and that if that can happen, once we shed kind of the burden of the physical world, then that's fantastic. But of course, we still have to figure out a way to deal with people who might abuse that ability for less worthy, aims.
Joan, can I jump back in here? So, thank you. Thank you. So I think in terms in representation and like bringing yourself in forms of yourself, it also doesn't necessarily need to be a different version of you, right? It could also just be more of yourself.
Yes.
And so a great example of this, if anyone has heard of Google's Project Starline, and if you haven't, please check it out on YouTube. Just Google YouTube Project Starline. It's essentially a next-gen video conferencing platform. So imagine yourself sitting in front of a magic window, and instead of a 2D video conference or Zoom, or I should say Google Meet, it feels like you're really there with the person and in 3D. So that is an example also of using mixed reality to bring more of yourself or a truer representation of yourself as well.
Yeah, exactly.
One group that we work with back in the US is called LGBT Tech, and it's a tech association focused, or an organization focused on LGBT youth. And they've talked to us about the positive potential of the metaverse and XR technology to help youth that might be struggling either with sexual orientation or with gender identity, to be able to take a relatively risk-free exploration of what it might feel like to be a different gender, what it feels like to embody that, and how you would be perceived and how others would interact with you. So I think that's one very positive application. And also, the whole idea of, as I said earlier, being able to sort of try out different personalities and explore aspects of yourself while you're still developing emotionally, I think it can be very healthy as well.
I think there's also really interesting kind of free speech and platform regulation issues here. I know that, on the Microsoft side, we've thought a lot about who are we to tell a user how they can represent themselves. Who are we to say, no, that's not actually your identity, sorry, you're this person. And so, of course, like I said before, of course you have the safety issues. There's an issue of, expectation setting, making sure that everyone who's engaging kind of understands the rules and what they should believe is true based on an avatar. But I think for the industry, for developers, platform builders, there is a real risk if we put ourselves in the position of deciding who a person is just based on those immutable characteristics.
Yep. And if I can just add one thing.
Oh, go ahead.
The idea of empathy, and I think everyone here has probably heard of XR described as the ultimate empathy machine. But I think that's another opportunity if you were to present yourself as someone from of a different ethnicity, a different gender, a different age, a fully able-bodied person versus someone who might deal with disabilities. Those are opportunities for you to learn more about what it feels like to be someone other than yourself, and to see how people respond to you, and to take that in and maybe adjust some of your own thoughts and behaviors. So another example of, I think, how this can be very positive.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and this morning, for those who've been there in the very first session, there was a company, Body Swap, who presented such a tool for learning emotional skills in switching roles. So yet another one. I was very impressed. If the person sits in the room, I was very impressed. Good. So let's focus a little bit more on how do we protect identity.
Yeah, that one is a tough one. So Google keeps billions of people safe online every day, and I think the way we think about it is kind of a three-pronged framework, right? So you have privacy by design, which I know is a buzzword, especially in policy circles, but what does that really mean? How are you investing in things like differential privacy or like a privacy sandbox? How do you build it as a P0 part of your development, right? It's really important. Second part of that framework is being secure by default. And so building also security, especially in this new computing paradigm where, if you remember that analogy of Photoshop to deepfakes, you're going to need more, you're going to need better, and you have to preempt bad actors as they look to either impersonate you or theft your identity. And then the last piece, which is really relevant for for mixed reality, I think, is having the user in control, making sure you're transparent about the information that you're collecting, how it's presented to them, how it's used, as well as giving them the option to turn off certain features or have like a very clean and easy way to be in control of that information.
I would second that. I feel, at least personally, very strongly that a person should be in control of their own experience, and that ultimately we are all responsible for ourselves. And I don't mean that in the way of, hey, you're on your own, buddy, like, good luck out there. I just mean that people should, it's a privilege to be able to be responsible for yourself. So I like to think of the direction of all of this as industry and users partnering, all having the same goal of creating positive experiences for people. And I think, ultimately that's what the industry is looking for, that's what developers are trying to create, and that's what the user wants. So whatever we can do in all of those categories to facilitate and create those positive experiences, I think is where we want to be headed. And I do believe that the industry and whether it's a hardware manufacturer or developer or creator, providing tools that are easy to use, that the user does have as much ability as possible to control their own experience. What that looks like, there are a lot, that again could be a whole new panel, but the idea of industry and users sort of partnering with the same objective, and the industry's role being providing tools, being transparent and clear, and then the communities themselves being transparent and clear about what type of environment you might be stepping into, and the user having the tools that they need to control that experience, I think is the right direction.
So yeah, I agree with what Karim said about privacy, and in fact, I don't see like a ton of new privacy issues coming in this space. I think that really it's the safety issues that are perhaps changing, and I think, in fact, Cornelia and I were talking before this about the kind of safety rubric at the moment. We talk a lot about content regulation and content moderation and takedown, and I think as we move more and more into mixed reality and metaverse, we're going to be talking a lot more about conduct. Yeah. And that's a space where, of course, the harm has happened. It's finite. It doesn't persist like conduct or content does, and so it can't be taken down. And so I agree with Joan completely. I think that where we can go is to think about how users protect themselves in the real world. We don't all rely on the state or the police to come in and take care of things and kick somebody out of our existence because they didn't behave in a very nice way. We institute self-help, and I think it is up to builders, platform developers, to create those tools that will allow users to take agency for their own experience and decide, how deeply they want to engage, how much they want to expose themselves to, with the assumption that there is some kind of reciprocal reward, but also reciprocal risk. The challenge there, where you have greater agency, you also have greater accountability. Right. And we all know that when someone gets kicked off of a service, it's not very hard to go get another free email address and just sign up again. And so without kind of a tie to an identifiable, verifiable existence, a real person, verified ID, it will be, I think, difficult. And these are all just kind of musings, but I think it will be difficult to really achieve that accountability. We'll have to come up with creative ways to do that, and then that's where you get to perhaps exacerbated privacy issues. Mm-hmm.
I want to stick very quickly with you, Karim, and we'll get back to the proactive measures and content versus conduct, as we discussed. But just, you mentioned a couple of different privacy tools, and of course these are, and I should now disclose, we have here a US panel. I'm working on European policy matters mostly, and I have always European data protection in my mind. But do you see sort of like that there could arise issues that are not well covered, or not, that might arise issues with how we think about data protection in the metaverse?
How do you mean?
Well, think about, for example, the different types of data that might be collected that GDPR has not thought about.
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one. So I'm not as familiar with GDPR because I am based in the States, but when we think about data, so one example might be advanced biometric information, right? So eye tracking, the dilation of your pupils and such, and I'm not sure that these are considerations that have been covered under previous acts like GDPR, or in the US like the CCPA, and so we'll have to recognize that there's a balance, and we'll have to thread the needle between how do we enable this innovation and enable these strong use cases that can really help people, right, in surgery and education and healthcare, and then also still protecting folks' data, giving them that control, making sure it's secure and private.
Sorry, I was picking on you.
No, it's okay.
You mentioned a couple of terminologies here that I thought is worthwhile to dig in, and this is eventually the good thing. There's so many new technology, new innovation in the protection field of privacy that come along with these new technologies. So I think there.
And I think the advantage is that these aren't really new topics, right? We always talk about privacy and security, or at least we have in the last decade or so. But now, how do we extend them into mixed reality, into these new computing paradigms?
Brings me to my next topic. So when you think about this evolution that you all talked about at the very beginning in the first question, what are just like the issues that persist historically when you think about the internet evolution, and then the new problems that arise, in particular thinking about accountability? How can you improve accountability for those who develop the metaverses, for example?
I'll take that one. Yeah, again, these are not new questions. There are very few questions under the sun that are new completely. And just also building on what Karim was saying, I think it's important for people to understand that the collection and use of some data, including things like pupil dilation, eye tracking, et cetera, which is considered much more sensitive, is necessary for this technology to function. So it's not that the evil empire is trying to get more information about the user, for nefarious purposes. That this information enables the technology. So at XRA, we're trying to educate. I mean, my job, I work a lot with lawmakers in Washington, so with those folks and their staff, but also just the general public. We want them to understand why this information is necessary, what functions of the devices that you're using it enables, and why that is necessary. So that's just sort of a foundational issue. But also the idea going back to empowering the user, and the user being in control of their experience and of their data, which really belongs to them. This notion of a partnership. And I think when we sort of boil it down, it comes down to consent. There needs to be that partnership between the industry side and the user side. And just sort of bringing this back full circle, the idea that certain sensitive information is necessary for the device to function, the user needs to understand that and needs to have the ability to consent to that. So these are sort of, these get into the weeds pretty quickly on the details of what that consent looks like, but I think this idea of partnership and consent is going to be very important to us as we sort of shape the governance of this technology.
So I think that the consent issue actually is super interesting, and I think there's a real challenge facing the industry as the technology gets more and more complicated and the data gets more and more sensitive, how to communicate here your whole job is explaining this to people on the Hill, and we expect users to read something online and understand it and consent to it, and I think that the industry really needs to think about how to convey the information to your average user in a way that is sufficiently digestible and understandable that the consent is valid, right, that they really understand what they're agreeing to. And I think that problem is only getting bigger and bigger as the technology gets more and more complicated. And again, that leads you kind of down the natural path of that analysis is then what happens when you get to children. who even in the best of circumstances, just contractually are not in a position to consent to that. And when the things you're consenting to are, yes, I understand how to use these tools, and yes, I understand how to protect myself in space, and I understand that who I'm engaging with isn't at all what they look or seem or purport to be. Those are real safety issues that have real physical consequences on people's body and their stress and their blood pressure and all kinds of things. And I do think that's a looming issue that the industry will have to figure out. How do we convey that information in a way that is reasonable to expect a person to take the time to digest and actually understand?
Yeah, both Carrie and Joan touched on this foundational concept of education, right? This industry is still very nascent, and I know we have a lot of folks here at Augmented World Expo who are really nuanced in their understanding of what they're working on, but that's not the case for the general public. And so making sure folks are educated, and by the way, that's not just the job of the industry association or industry, it's also the job of the press for responsible journalism, peers, and the public as well to take an active role in this, as well as policymakers. So we've seen, I think, across jurisdictions that we still struggle to understand and regulate and legislate, Web 2.0. How do we make sure we do an even better job for a more complex topic as we head into the future? So it's going to be, I think, a team effort.
Yep.
I want to make it a little bit even more complicated to bring in a new topic that relates to identity, which is anonymity in the metaverse. I mean, anonymity is already on the internet a big topic, and often in contradiction with other policy objectives such as safety or security. So how do we think about anonymity and the new paradigm to control the identity in the mixed reality in the metaverse?
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier. Anonymity comes with a lot of benefits, but also has several pitfalls, and I think again, the framework I would fall back on is privacy by design in the applications and the hardware that you're using, making it secure by default, so making it as secure as possible, and then making sure the user is informed and has control over their information, so they know where it's going and how they're presenting themselves, going back to the point on identity.
Well, I think the concept of anonymity is not a new one. Like so many of these questions, these are this is a new construct in which we're asking these questions, but the questions are not new. I mean, you had Cyrano de Bergerac wrote anonymous love letters. So, the idea of not wanting your identity to be known for whatever reason, good or bad, is something that, we've had to think about for forever. And there are benefits and there are negatives, I think, to that as well. So it's, again, I think this comes down to users. What do they want from an experience? Bless you. You asked earlier about the issue of accountability. To what extent is a manufacturer or a platform or a creator responsible for these things if someone is acting anonymously or not? To what extent is the user responsible for that? And this is getting a little bit off topic, but it goes back to something Carrie said earlier. We have to think about the real world versus the metaverse, and what kind of metaverse do we want? A lot of people, I think, look at this as an opportunity to create sort of a utopian world where we look at all the mistakes, not only of the internet and online communications, but of our culture, of our human societies, and this is a chance to create something that's more perfect. But is that realistic, and is that what we want? The real world is not perfect. There are harms. There are wonderful things that happen. There are not so wonderful things that happen. What do we want this metaverse to look like? Will it reflect the real world, or do we want to contain it and have it be more utopian, which will come with more restrictions and I think less empowerment for people ultimately? Way off topic from what you asked, but anyway.
No, not at all. This is almost like an answer to one of the questions. So if someone wants to ask a question, you can just walk to the mic and
Cornelia,
get ready.
can I address your question though about anonymity? Because I think there are two levels to anonymity, right? There is, are you anonymous in that like you've presented yourself in a way that is not reflective of who you really are, and so you're anonymous to other users. But there's also your anonymity to the platform. So if we're talking about anonymity to other users, I think that's really just another flavor of this kind of not presenting yourself consistent with your presentation in the physical world. But anonymity to the platform, I think goes to your kind of ending point on accountability. And I just from my personal point of view would question kind of what benefit obviously it's great to have privacy and to be able to control where your data goes, but a complete lack of accountability for your behavior to any authority that has their kind of terms, and I do think that creates serious questions around safety and even how users can engage understanding what the rules of the road are. And without that, I do think you're more likely to kind of incentivize antisocial behavior than pro-social behavior.
Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I guess my question would be like, is there like existing tools? I hear a lot of like, protection, also like having the users to have that control, but how about ownership? Like tools to really own your data. So I always see it as your digital consciousness. I always think that we move in different realms, like the physical, the digital, and also the spiritual. So those three realms were interacting simultaneously. So are there any existing tools for educating people that this somehow, some way gets you more of an ownership? I know some groups that has been developing some tools for ownership, but there's a lot of web into it. I get that, but is there anything that's at least is closing to like being approved, or something that people can look into?
So this may not exactly touch on your question, but I think the concept is relevant. So Google, I think it was even this week, released this thing called My Ad Center, and one of the pieces of scrutiny that's leveled, especially at big tech companies, is what are you doing with this data? Why can't I control what it is, or what I see, or what ads are served to me? And this tool called My Ad Center, it allows you to pick and choose which ads you're shown, what data it's based on, and you can choose to not see those ads. And so stepping outside of the ads world for a second, with AR and VR, I think the onus will be on industry to really give the user control in ways that we don't even know exist yet, right? Because we don't know what the metaverse or what AR and VR will look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now. I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but...
I mean, when you talk about tools, like obviously we all know about the safety bubble, which I may have misunderstood your question, but I don't see that really helping users to kind of balance across the three dimensions that you specified, at least not overtly. But of course, a person may want to interact in digital space, but they want to do it in a way that allows them to kind of protect themselves from unwanted behavior, unwanted aggression, and that could be because of a spiritual need, or whatever the motivation is. So I do think there are some just beginning examples of tools that allow a user to kind of balance the different aspects of how they engage, whether those are their representation, their exposure, which could be both physical and emotional, but I think there's a long way to go. I think that as interaction becomes more immersive, more persistent, and more physical, there is kind of a gaping hole in providing that tooling to users. What is the digital equivalent to tear gas? What is the digital equivalent to a map or a phone that is ready to dial emergency as you're walking down a dark alley? We don't have that, and so I think that is an opportunity.
Thank you so much for your question. It was actually similar to something that I wanted to ask, so thanks for making my life easier. But before I get to that, I wanted to also just go back to identity in itself and ask what role identity plays. to enable better diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it relates a little bit to this, how do we protect ourselves in the internet? But what's your view on that?
Me? Okay. I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit when I talked about that the point was to bring people together, and of course if people don't feel comfortable, it's going to be hard for them to come together. I think one of the worst things that could happen, well, maybe that's a little bit exaggerating, but it would not be a good outcome if you ended up with digital spaces kind of carrying over a lot of the social norms that we see today that exclude lots of groups from real participation. And we will see, and I think the risk here is not only in digital space, but in access to the digital space. So we haven't talked a lot, because we're talking about identity and mixed reality, but we haven't talked a lot about the impact of like the digital divide and access to internet and services and what that means. And so if the principle is, like I said, that everyone is supposed to be able to come together and behave and engage with each other without the confines of the physical world, then access to that space becomes super critical. Not only access in that you can represent yourself in a way that is honest, but literal access. So I do think, like, if we're thinking about identity and how that is relevant to inclusion in these new business models and new ways of engaging, we have to think about not only your identity insofar as how you're representing yourself in digital space, but just who you are and what your world circumstances are.
Yeah, I think on the topic of access and also diversity, equity, and inclusion, you have to bring folks into the conversation, right? So like Joan mentioned, the LGBTQ plus group she was working with. It depends, and when it comes to identity specifically, you need to bring people in that haven't necessarily been represented before, people who haven't had access before. So an example to bring this to life maybe is Google's Real Tone, and if you're not familiar, Real Tone is trying to address the challenge of folks with darker skin complexions like mine. Historically, we haven't shown up in photos properly, and that's because film cameras and even digital cameras have been optimized for folks with lighter skin complexions. And so what Google did was bring people to the table, right? Cinematographers, people of color, photographers, experts who recognize that this has been an issue for a long time, and then tried to address it, right? Can we computationally photograph these, recognize folks' skin tones, and then allow them to be represented more clearly? So I would expect and I would hope that industry and other players would kind of extend that kind of learning into new forms in mixed reality in the future.
And maybe there are some learnings from also the social media and other tools in which we can learn. And then a little bit going back to the question from the audience. There is when you think about, you mentioned this a little bit, Carrie, when you think about how do we actually equip ourselves or the avatars or new identity or extended identity in the metaverse, there's tools out there that have been developed to address issues like on social media, online, in platforms that relate largely to content. And so I'd like to see whether they can be used, or do they need to be different? Do we need to think differently about the substance of what we are dealing with? Carrie, you have a specific view on this. Maybe we start with you.
Are you asking about the content versus conduct? Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot about content review and content moderation, and there's lots of tools that look at the content that's available on a particular product or site, and look for lots of red or lots of skin tone colors or things like that. And all of that is great, but it all is designed to address a harm that persists for so long as content is available. And then you take the content down and the harm is mitigated. In the space of conduct, obviously the harm has already happened. The only way to really address it is to try to prevent the harm from happening at all, which either means removing the perpetrator's access to the service, or preventing them from being successful in the first place. And there's lots of different strategies for that, tooling, protective tooling. There's also quite a lot of research happening on culture creation, and how do we create pro-social spaces online, and what is the culture of a particular metaverse or a particular space that users might engage in. and how can developers facilitate, pro-social or anti-social culture creation. So we're running low on time, but I do think those are some really interesting tactics that will will become much more relevant as online engagement shifts away from it being primarily content driven to more conduct.
Okay, thanks. And we are indeed running out of time. I don't see anybody jumping to the mic anymore, so I will then ask just to sum it up with how should we think about moving forward in this space, and if you can be just very succinct in 25 seconds.
Yeah. You guys mine was my answer before.
Good.
Bring people together, educate, and make sure we take on this responsibility seriously.
And I would say making sure that industry and users are thinking of each other as collaborators and partners to create the best experience possible, which is, I think, ultimately what everyone wants.
Yep, agree.
Absolutely fantastic. In time, we conclude. So thank you very much for the audience. Thank you for the brave question. And thank you for the audience online as well.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for this.